The sound of his voice hit me like a freight train. I'd just swung the wrought iron gate shut behind me, my arms loaded with grocery bags, my sneakers scuffing the dirt path that wound from the estate into the forest. The late afternoon sun was warm, but there was still that early spring chill in the air, sharp enough to keep you alert. Then I heard it, a low, gravelly whisper drifting from the pines. "Sarah." My heart slammed against my chest so hard I thought it'd leave a mark. I stopped dead, nearly dropping the bag of oranges in my grip. I hadn't heard that voice in 5 years. Not in dreams, not in old voicemails I couldn't bear to delete, not even in my darkest moments of grief or desperation. Ethan was gone, presumed dead. Yet I turned toward the sound like I was under a spell. That moment, standing there in the fading golden light, wondering if my mind had finally cracked. That wasn't the real start of it, not truly. The real beginning was slower, quieter, the kind that sneaks up while you're busy acting like everything's okay. My name is Sarah Bennett. I was 32 when it happened, when my supposedly dead husband came back from nowhere and ripped open scars I'd spent years trying to heal. After Ethan disappeared, I stayed put. I stayed in the little craftsman-style house in Oregon's Willamette Valley that he'd inherited from this grandpa. I kept the vegetable garden thriving, paid the utility bills, and looked after his mom, Margaret, who had a stroke the year after he vanished. She and I, we held onto each other like survivors clutching a lifeboat, refusing to sink under the weight of all the questions no one could answer. The locals whispered, as small towns do, maybe he took off. Maybe he was stepping out on her. Maybe she's hiding something. But Margaret never pointed a finger at me. She'd cup my face in her frail hands and say, "He's still out there, honey. I know it in my gut." So I kept going. I cooked. I cared for her. I waited, not in some wide-eyed delusional way, but the way a farmer waits for rain. Patiently, quietly. 2 years back, I started working as a housekeeper at a sprawling estate owned by Ms. Evelyn Harper, a private, well-off woman who didn't care about my baggage, as long as I was reliable, discreet, and could mend a torn hem like nobody's business. I juggled 3 roles there: maid, seamstress, and sometimes errand runner. The pay was cash, no questions asked, and generous enough to keep the lights on. No benefits, no safety net, just money, trust, and quiet. Every morning, I'd leave the house by 6:45, walk 10 minutes to the bus stop, then ride out to the hills where the Harper estate sat, tucked between rolling vineyards and towering firs. After my shift, I'd head home, make dinner, sort Margaret's meds, and maybe, if I wasn't bone-tired, flip through a dog-eared paperback romance for her collection. It wasn't a life, not really, but it was a rhythm. And sometimes a rhythm's enough to keep you from falling apart. That afternoon was nothing special. I'd finished work early, grabbed groceries from the co-op in town, and decided to take the long way home through the woods since the air was crisp and the paths were dry. I was halfway down the trail when I heard it again. "Sarah." The voice was rough, like it had been scraped raw by years of silence. I spun around, and there, just beyond the tree line, stood a man in the dim glow of the setting sun. He was gaunt, his clothes tattered, his hair shaggy and longer than I'd ever seen it. But it was him. Ethan. My breath caught, and my body forgot how to move. All I could do was stare, my mind screaming, "He's real. He's here. He's back." But then came the quieter thought, sharp and cold. Why now? And why is he looking at me like he doesn't know me? I didn't rush to him. My feet felt glued to the forest floor, like the roots of the moss-draped pines around us. I must have looked unhinged, grocery bags swinging from my arms, jaw slack, tears stinging my eyes before I even registered them. He took a cautious step forward, like he thought I'd disappear if he moved too fast. His gaze roamed my face, searching, as if piecing together a memory. "Sarah," he said again, the word fragile, like it was all he had left. That sound, my name in his voice, cracked something inside me. The bag slicked from my hands, oranges tumbling into the ferns, and I stumbled toward him. It wasn't graceful. I didn't care. I closed the gap and threw my arms around him. He didn't push me away, but his embrace was hesitant, his hands lingering before resting lightly on my back, like he'd forgotten how to hold someone who loved him. "Where have you been?" I choked out. my face pressed against his chest. "Do you know what you've put us through? Do you even know what year it is?" He didn't answer. He just murmured, "Let's go home, Sarah, please." So we went. We walked in silence down the dirt path, past the rose bushes I'd pruned, the shed I'd repainted last spring, the creaky gate Margaret and I had fixed together. It felt like a dream I couldn't wake from. I kept stealing glances at him, terrified he'd vanish again, but he stayed. When we reached the porch, I pushed open the screen door and called out, "Margaret, you need to see this." She was in the kitchen, folding dish towels, her silver hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She stepped into the hall, saw him, and froze. The towel slipped from her hands. Her lips quivered. "Ethan." He gave a single nod. She braced herself against the wall, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were gone. I buried you in my heart 1,000 times. Don't you dare step inside unless you're real." "I'm real, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. She let out a sob and rushed to him, her thin arms wrapping around his neck. He buried his face in her shoulder, and for the first time since he appeared, I saw tears in his eyes. I stepped back, watching from the doorway, feeling like a stranger in my own house. Later, after the tears and questions and disbelief had settled into a heavy quiet, we sat at the kitchen table. Ethan picked at the stew I'd warmed up, eating slowly, like he was relearning how to taste. Margaret watched him like he might disappear if she blinked. I kept glancing between them, waiting for someone to ask the question we were all avoiding. Finally, I couldn't stand it. "Ethan, where were you? What happened?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or shame. "I'll tell you everything," he said softly, "but not tonight. I'm not ready." It should have been a warning, but I was too drained to press, too desperate to believe this wasn't a mirage. I cleared the table, helped Margaret to bed, and set out clean towels for Ethan in the guest room, his old room. When I finally slid into bed, my chest tight with 1,000 unanswered questions, I whispered to the darkness, "He's back. He's really back." But even as I said it, a quiet unease gnawed at me. Something was wrong. It took him 2 days to open up. 2 days of fleeting glances, stilted small talk, and long stretches of silence over coffee. Ethan spent hours on the porch, wrapped in an old quilt, staring into the woods. Margaret hovered nearby, afraid to touch him, afraid to let him out of her sight. On the 3rd evening, I handed him a mug of chamomile tea and sat across from him in the living room. The wood stove crackled, casting warm shadows across the walls. Outside, the valley was shrouded in fog, like it belonged to another world. "Talk to me," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I need to know where you've been, Ethan, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts." He didn't meet my eyes at first, but then he nodded, like he was finally letting go of something he'd been carrying too long. "It started at work," he said. "You remember the shipping company?" Ethan began, his voice low, like he was pulling the words from a deep well. "Things were falling apart. Trucks going missing, clients bailing, deals collapsing. The boss was paranoid. Thought someone was tipping off competitors or skimming inventory." I remembered those nights. He'd come home wired, rubbing his forehead, grumbling about screw-ups that weren't his fault. Then one day, he went on, "My supervisor told me to meet a delivery at a new spot. Said it was off the books, safer. Gave me an address out by the old warehouses off Route 99. My stomach knotted. I knew that area. Rusted chain-link fences, abandoned lots. He nodded, reading my expression. I should have seen it coming, but I needed the job, so I went. It was late afternoon, sun glaring in my eyes. Someone hit me from behind. I shut my eyes, my pulse hammering like I was the one struck. "When I came to," he whispered, "I was in the back of a van, hands zip-tied, head throbbing like it'd been cracked open. They must have drugged me. Everything was a fog, like I couldn't grab onto my own thoughts." He paused, his fingers shaking around the mug. I reached out, covering his hand with mine, and this time he didn't flinch. "They took me to some compound, middle of nowhere. No cell service, no road noise, just woods and barbed wire. There were these greenhouse setups, like a farm, but not the kind you'd see in a seed catalog." His breath hitched, eyes distant. "They said I owed them, money, debts, something. Said I'd work it off. Never told me how long. Just gave me a uniform, orders, and barely enough food to keep going. I wanted to ask who they were, why him, but the questions felt useless. So I let him keep talking. There were others there, men, women, some stuck for years. They called it the operation. We weren't supposed to talk, but I met someone, a girl named Lily. That name hit like a cold spike. I tried to hide it, but my face betrayed me. She was young, maybe 19, green but sharp, not like the others. She paid attention, tracked the guards' routines, spotted where they stashed their radios. My throat tightened. "She helped you get out," I said, not a question. He shook his head. "She got us all out, in a way. One night, she distracted a guard, swiped his phone, and sent a text to her dad. Turns out he's some big-shot surgeon with connections. He pulled every string he had. FBI, state police, you name it. 3 days later, the place was swarmed. "And you?" I asked. My voice steady despite the chone in my chest. "I was in one of the greenhouses when the vans rolled in. Saw the tactical teams storm the buildings. I didn't move, just watched. Then, Lily grabbed my arm, dragged me to a car I didn't know. Her dad was behind the wheel." I swallowed hard. "So you were with her?" "No," he said, too quick. "They offered me a safe house while the feds sorted it out, but I told them I had to get back to you and Mom." I wanted to believe him, desperately. But there was a hitch in his voice, a crack that didn't quite seal. "She risked everything," he added, softer. "Without her, I'd still be there." I stood, my legs unsteady. "I need to check the laundry." "Sarah, wait," he said, standing too fast, his chair scraping the floor. "I'm not telling you this to push you away." I looked at him, the man I'd grieved, the man I'd waited for. He was here, but parts of him weren't. And I wasn't sure they ever would be. Something shifted after that night, but not the way I'd hoped. I thought his story would bridge the gap, pull us closer, but it only made the silence heavier. In the days that followed, Ethan stayed. He ate with us, mowed the lawn, sat with me on the porch swing at dusk. But there was a hollowness to him, like he was a guest in his own life. He didn't touch me like he used to. No goodnight kisses, no easy warmth. If I rested my head on his shoulder, he'd tense, like I'd startled him. I told myself it was trauma, that he needed time, that love could wait. But deep down, I knew the man who came back wasn't the one I'd lost. It all unraveled the next Saturday. I'd just gotten home from the Harper estate, still in my work boots, when I saw them. 2 unfamiliar SUVs parked by the fence. The SUVs were sleek, black, and out of place in our quiet corner of the valley. My stomach twisted as I approached the house. Laughter floated from the dining room, soft and warm, like it belonged to a Sunday family dinner. For a moment, I thought Margaret had guests, maybe her brother Tom or her cousin Linda dropping by. But when I stepped inside, my breath caught. At our table sat a young woman, striking, with blonde hair pulled into a loose braid. She was holding Ethan's hand. Beside her was a polished couple, dressed like they'd stepped out of a country club. Her parents. Ethan wasn't looking at me. His eyes were on her. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching my life unravel. Margaret turned, her face softening with unease. "Sarah, honey, I thought you were staying late at work." Her voice wavered, just enough to betray her. I forced a tight smile. "Guess I got done early." Ethan finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said, like I was a stranger stopping by for coffee. "I want you to meet someone. This is Lily, and these are her parents, Dr. Robert Hayes and Mrs. Catherine Hayes. They're the ones who got us out." Lily smiled at me, confident, like she belonged at my table. I nodded, my chest numb. I don't recall sitting down or what I said. All I remember is her fingers brushing Ethan's arm as she recounted their escape, how he'd shielded her, made her laugh, even in that nightmare. She wasn't cruel. She was honest. And that honesty cut deeper than any betrayal. When silence settled over the table, I locked eyes with Ethan. "Do you want a divorce?" The words came out steady, unflinching. He didn't recoil, just looked at me with a sad, almost apologetic gaze. "I don't want to hurt you, Sarah," he said, "but pretending would hurt more." I nodded, slow and deliberate. "Okay." Louis stared at her hands. Her parents exchanged a quick glance. Margaret stayed silent. And just like that, I knew the man I'd mourned, the man I'd waited for, was no longer mine. I stood, offered a polite smile, and said, "Excuse me, I'll get Mom's medical papers ready for the clinic, since you're all heading there together." I turned away before the tears could show, but they came anyway, not for his leaving, but because he'd never truly come back. The days that followed were a masterclass in swallowing pain. Ethan didn't leave right away. He stayed in the guest room, a ghost in his own house. Lily and her parents came and went, always courteous, their voices smooth and professional, wrapping their intrusion in a veneer of kindness. They offered to move Ethan and Margaret to a private clinic near Salem. Full coverage for tests, rehab, even a thorough checkup for Ethan to rule out any health issues from his captivity. Margaret seemed overwhelmed but grateful, her eyes bright with hope. Ethan was passive, like a pawn in someone else's game. Me? I photocopied insurance forms, booked appointments, labeled Margaret's pill bottles, and packed her belongings into a tidy suitcase. I kept my voice calm, my hands steady. I kept my smile in place. I didn't cry. Not in front of them. One afternoon, Lily slipped into the kitchen, barefoot, like she was at home. She leaned against the counter, sipping water, watching me sort Margaret's medical forms into neat stacks. "You're so put together," she said, her voice light. "I'd lose track of all this in a day." I nodded, my hands steady. "Someone's got to do it." She paused, then said, "I hope you don't hate me, Sarah." I looked up. Her face was open, almost childlike. "I don't hate you," I said evenly, "but I'd like you to leave the kitchen now." Her eyes widened, caught off guard, and she backed out without another word. That night, I sat with Margaret as she sipped her chamomile tea. She looked older than ever, her hands trembling, her eyes rimmed red. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice thin. "I'm so sorry. I know this isn't right. I know how it looks. But Ethan's my boy and I can't turn him away." I nodded. "You don't need to explain. I understand." "No," she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "You don't. If I were stronger, I'd tell them all to go. I'd tell Ethan to snap out of it. But I'm worn out, Sarah, and part of me is just grateful he's breathing." Her voice broke. "I never thought I'd see him again." "I know," I whispered, looking away from the guilt in her eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said, "but this house is yours as long as you need it." I gave her a small, weary smile. "I'll stay until I figure things out. I won't leave you on your own." "You're not on your own either," she said softly. "I hope you know that." The next morning, I packed a duffel bag and drove to the old apartment on the edge of town, the one Ethan and I had shared in our first year of marriage. It had been rented out since we moved, but the latest tenants had just left. My cousin Linda had been managing it for me. I stepped inside, the linoleum scuffed, the curtains faded, and my knees gave way. I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't part of his story going forward. But I was still here, and that had to mean something. The apartment smelled of dust and old paint, but it was mine. Linda and her husband Tom showed up 2 hours after I called. She brought armfuls of linens. Tom pulled up with a van full of thrift store furniture. Within an hour, the kitchen had a table. The bed had fresh sheets, and there were small pots of herbs, basil, thyme, and oregano, lining the windowsill. I hadn't asked for any of it, but they came anyway. That night, we sat cross-legged on the floor, eating takeout from paper containers and drinking cheap wine from mismatched mugs. It wasn't a party, but it wasn't a funeral either. "You gonna be okay here?" Tom asked, eyeing the apartment like he was sizing up every flaw. I nodded. "It's not much, but I need the room to breathe." Linda gave me a knowing look. Sometimes healing starts with a place of your own. Around 8 p.m., a knock came at the door. Tom got up to answer it. I heard Tom's voice shift, friendly but curious. "Hey, Matt," he called out. "Sarah, you remember Matt, right?" I did, vaguely. Matt had gone to high school with Tom, a quiet guy who now worked as a carpenter in town. He drove a beat-up red pickup with faded seats and a scruffy dog always riding shotgun. He stepped inside, a small toolbox in one hand, a covered dish in the other. "Figured you could use some curtain rods," he said, "and maybe a home-cooked meal." I blinked, caught off guard. "How'd you—" He smiled, soft and unassuming. "Small town, people talk, but I only listen when it's someone worth hearing about." Linda raised an eyebrow at me, that subtle matchmaking glint only a cousin could pull off. I ignored it. Matt didn't linger. He hung a curtain rod, fixed a sticky drawer, and offered a smile that didn't ask for anything in return. Just kind. Nothing more. After he left, Tom leaned in. "He's got a thing for you." I shook my head. Don't start. No pressure, Linda said, sipping her wine. But it wouldn't hurt to let someone be good to you for once. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready. But that night, lying in my old bed in this new chapter of my life, I realized I hadn't thought about Ethan for a solid hour. It felt like a small victory. The next morning, I called Miss Harper to tell her I wouldn't be back full-time. She sounded disappointed but kind. You were always too sharp for scrubbing floors, Sarah, she said. Need extra sewing work? You call me. Your stitches are better than anything in those fancy Portland boutiques. I thanked her, hung up, and sat with the phone in my hand, the silence settling around me. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Ex-wife, caretaker, seamstress, nobody. But I was something, and I was moving forward. That afternoon, Matt dropped off a stack of flyers for a night course at the local community college, certified nursing assistant training, practical, short-term, affordable. He didn't say much, just left them on the stoop with a sticky note. You're already good at this. Might as well get paid. I laughed out loud, the sound surprising me. It was the first time I'd laughed in what felt like forever. Maybe the path back to myself wasn't about grand transformations. Maybe it was built on curtain rods, covered dishes, and handwritten notes. The first weeks in the apartment slipped by like rain through open fingers, messy, quick, hard to hold. I took on small sewing jobs from Miss Harper's contacts, hemming tailored slacks, mending vintage dresses, repairing old quilts that smelled of cedar and thyme. I worked at the kitchen table, the radio humming soft country tunes, the breeze from my cracked window carrying the scent of wet asphalt. It was quiet, sometimes lonely, but not crushing. I enrolled in the nursing course, 3 nights a week, 4 hours each. Being in a classroom felt strange, surrounded by women younger, older, and some like me, carrying lives heavy with loss, but still showing up. We practiced injections on plastic arms, learned to check vitals, reposition patients, dress wounds. I realized I'd already done most of it for Margaret, quietly, without fanfare or a paycheck. Now I'd do it with purpose, with a name for it. Margaret called now and then. She said Ethan was doing well, that the clinic near Salem was top-notch. Lily visited often, bringing novels, supplements, and playlists on her phone. I told her I was glad, and maybe part of me was. Sometimes I'd hang up and feel nothing. Other times I'd cry for 10 minutes. Not even sure why. Then I'd brew tea, sit at my sewing machine, and finish whatever was in front of me. I wasn't whole, but I wasn't shattered either, just pieced together differently. Matt started stopping by more, never too often, just enough. He fixed a dripping faucet, brought soup when I had a cold, lent me a pair of work gloves when I mentioned mine were fraying. He never asked for anything, never pushed. One Saturday, I found a folded paper tucked under my doormat. It was a pencil sketch on notebook paper, a small porch strung with fairy lights, a sewing machine framed in the window, and a tabby curled up on a cushion below. In Matt's neat handwriting, a note. Just an idea. My smile stretched so wide it ached. I didn't call him right away, but I tacked the sketch to my fridge. That night, alone in my apartment, I whispered, "You're doing all right, Sarah." For the first time in 5 years, I believed it. I wasn't waking up for someone else. Wasn't caught in the limbo between hope and loss. I was just living. Not every day sparkled, but they were 9, not his. I saw him again on a Tuesday. I'd just finished a practical exam at the clinic, my backpack heavy with textbooks, my hands smelling of hand sanitizer. As I crossed the lobby, tugging my jacket straight, I stopped cold. There was Ethan, standing at the reception desk, filling out paperwork. His jawline was sharper than I remembered, his beard neat, his stance steadier. Beside him was Lily, her belly rounded under a soft blue cardigan, one hand resting gently on it. They looked like a stock photo from a parenting magazine, whole, happy, expecting. For a split second, my chest tightened, urging me to vanish. But then Lily turned, her eyes catching mine. Surprise flickered across her face, then hesitation. She nudged Ethan. He looked up, and our gazes locked. The air went still. I smiled, not out of pain or reflex, but because I meant it. He started to speak, but I gave a small nod and walked past, not cruelly, just finished. Outside, the November wind carried a swirl of dry leaves. I pulled my scarf tighter and kept moving. The world didn't pause, it never does. But at the end of the block, I saw Matt, leaning against his red pickup, holding 2 coffee cups, that easy half smile on his face. Looked like you could use a warm-up, he said, offering me one. I took it, my fingers curling around the paper cup's heat. You always know, I said. He shrugged. I pay attention. We stood there, quiet, letting the moment settle. I didn't feel like I was standing in Ethan's shadow anymore, or like a footnote in someone else's story. I felt present, here. I turned to him, my voice soft. You ever think about second chances? He glanced at me, eyes steady, all the time, especially for people who think they don't deserve one. We climbed into his truck and drove, no fancy destination, just out to where the Val's trees blazed gold and the air smelled of pine and earth. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes. I didn't know where life was headed next, but I knew one thing. I was done waiting. For Ethan, for closure, for anyone to hand me permission. I'd already survived the worst. Now, I was free to start again. Not as someone's wife, not as the woman who waited, but as me, Sarah. And at last, that was enough.